Chapter 55. The dark was hostile, filled with invisible enemies waiting to strike her, and Elizabeth realized now that she was completely at their mercy. Detective Campagna had brought her here to be murdered. He was Reese's man. Elizabeth remembered Max Horning explaining about switching the jeep. Whoever did it had help. Someone who knew the island. How convincing Detective Campagna had been. We've been covering all the boats and airports, because Reese had known she would come here to hide. Where would you like to wait? At the police station or your villa? Detective Campagna had had no intention of letting her go to the police. It had not been headquarters he had phoned. It had been Reese. We're at the villa. Elizabeth knew she had to flee, but she no longer had the strength. She was fighting to keep her eyes open, and her arms and legs felt heavy. She suddenly realized why. He had drugged her coffee. Elizabeth turned and made her way into the dark kitchen. She opened a cabinet and fumbled around until she found what she wanted. She took down a bottle of vinegar and splashed some into a glass with water and forced herself to drink it. Immediately she began to retch into the sink. In a few minutes she felt a little better, but she was still weak. Her brain refused to function. It was as if all the circuits inside her head had already closed down, were preparing for the darkness of death. No, she told herself fiercely. You're not going to die like that. You're going to fight. They're going to have to kill you. She raised her voice and said, Reese, come and kill me. But her voice was barely a whisper. She turned and headed for the hallway, feeling her way by instinct. She stopped under the portrait of old Samuel, while outside the moaning, alien wind tore against the house, screaming at her, taunting her, warning her. She stood there in the blackness, alone, facing a choice of terrors. She could go outside, into the unknown, and try to escape from Reese. Or she could stay here and try to fight him. But how? Her mind was trying to tell her something, but she was still dazed by the drug. She could not concentrate. Something about an accident. She remembered then and said aloud, He has to make it look like an accident. You must stop him, Elizabeth. Had Samuel spoken? Or was it in her mind? It can't, it's too late. Her eyes were closing, and her face was pressed against the coolness of the portrait. It would be so wonderful to go to sleep. But there was something she had to do. She tried to remember what it was, but it kept slipping away. Don't let it look like an accident. Make it look like murder. Then the company will never belong to him. Elizabeth knew what she had to do. She walked into the study, stood there a moment, then reached for a table lamp and hurled it against the mirror. She could hear them both smash. She lifted a small chair and pounded it against the wall until the chair began to splinter. She moved over to the bookcase and began ripping pages out of the books, scattering them around the room. She tore the useless telephone cord out of the wall. Let Reese explain this to the police, she thought. Do not go gentle into that good night. Well, she would not go gentle. They would have to take her by force. A sudden gale swept through the room, swirling the papers through the air, then died away. It took Elizabeth a moment to realize what had happened. She was no longer alone in the house. At Leonardo da Vinci Airport, near the Mersey area where freight was handled, Detective Max Hornung was watching a helicopter land. By the time the pilot had his door open, Max was at his side. Can you fly me to Sardinia? He asked. The pilot stared at him. What's going on? I just flew somebody there. There's a bad storm blowing. Will you take me? It'll cost you triple. Max did not even hesitate. He climbed into the helicopter. As they took off, Max turned to the pilot and asked, Who was the passenger you took to Sardinia? His name was Williams. The dark was Elizabeth's ally now, concealing her from the killer. It was too late to get away. She had to try to find a place to hide somewhere in the house. She went upstairs, putting distance between herself and Reese. At the top of the stairs she hesitated, then turned towards Sam's bedroom. Something leaped at her out of the dark, and she started to scream. But it was only the shadow of a wind-whipped tree through the window. Her heart was pounding so hard that she was sure that Reese would be able to hear it downstairs. Delay him, her mind said. But how? Her head felt heavy. Everything was fuzzy. Think, she told herself. What would old Samuel have done? She walked to the bedroom at the end of the hall, took the key from the inside and locked the door from the outside. Then she locked the other doors, and they were the doors of the gates of the ghetto in Krakow. And Elizabeth was not sure why she was doing it. And then she remembered that she had killed Aram and that they must not catch her. She saw the beam of a flashlight below, starting to move up the stairs. and her heart leaped. Reese was coming for her. Elizabeth began to climb the tower stairs, and halfway up, her knees began to buckle. She slid to the floor and crawled the rest of the way on her hands and knees. She reached the top of the stairs and dragged herself upright, opened the door to the tower room and went in. "The door," Samuel said. "Lock the door." Elizabeth locked the door, but she knew that would not keep Reese out. At least, she thought, he will have to break it down. More violence to explain. Her death was going to look like murder. She pushed furniture against the door, moving slowly, as though the darkness were a heavy sea dragging her down. She pushed a table against the door, then an armchair and another table, working like an automation, fighting for time, building her pitiable fortress against her. From the floor below she heard a crash, and a moment later another and then a third. Reese was breaking down the bedroom doors, looking for her. Signs of an attack, a trail for the police to follow. She had tricked them, as he had tricked her. Yet something was vaguely bothering her. If Reese had to make her death look like an accident, why was he breaking doors down? She moved to the French doors and looked outside, listening to the mad wind singing in dirge to her. Beyond the balcony there was a sheer drop to the sea below. There was no escape from this room. This was where Reese would have to come to get her. Elizabeth felt around for a weapon, but there was nothing that could help her. She waited in the dark for her killer. What was Reese waiting for? Why didn't he break the door down and get it over with? Break the door down! Something was wrong. Even if he took her body away from here and disposed of it somewhere else, Reese would still not be able to explain the violence of the house, the smashed mirror, the broken doors. Elizabeth tried to put herself into Reese's mind, to figure out what plan he could have that would explain all those things without the police suspecting him of her death. There was only one way, and even as Elizabeth thought of it, she could smell the smoke.